Hello everyone, this is Mason, and I've been attempting to map out the cultures, languages, and genetics of the world for quite some time now, and my latest project was going so great until my laptop randomly decided to crash, corrupting literally all of my files from the past couple years, turning all of my research and hard work into this. This sent me into a major downward spiral, and I was pretty depressed about having to redo literal years of work. But during that time, I realized that, hey, it was kind of stupid, it kind of sucked. I mean, pixels? Come on. I took way too many shortcuts in the past and never really gave the best product I could give. So, for the past year, I've been learning, researching, and documenting. I wanted to give myself a challenge. I wanted to map a region of the world very few people have ever mapped before and go into more detail than most people could ever imagine, and hence by mashing together dozens and dozens of sources and with the help of AI, I've created literally the largest map I've ever seen on the internet, approximately 23,000 by 18,000 pixels in dimensions, translating to around 420 million pixels. So, needless to say, the crappy pixelated Mesa maps of the past are done for. I've always been fascinated by the people and culture of Latin America, but possibly my favorite region is Central America, the small collection of nations situated between Mexico and South America. At a glance, there are similarities between these Central American countries and neighboring Latino and Caribbean cultures, but each country, and even each region of each country, has a unique history and demographic makeup that has been influenced by dozens of indigenous and outside cultures. I wanted to not only showcase each specific culture, but also the degrees and ways in which they have interacted with each other and evolved over the centuries, which many outsiders, and US Americans in particular, have a very hard time grasping. For instance, although intermixing between different ethnic groups in the US was very uncommon up until the early 20th century, and interracial marriage was illegal in many areas up until the 60s, in Latin America and Central America, not only has intermarriage been the norm for centuries, but their modern identities are actually built upon the fact that they are multi-ethnic, multicultural nations. Under the Spanish, these areas saw rapid and significant demographic changes with the importation of African slaves and migration of Europeans, with Europeans, Africans, and natives intermixing extensively, which led to the Spanish creating a system of preferential treatment and rights to individuals based on their ancestral makeup, with peninsulares or European-born Spaniards on top, and a move that very much mirrored the ancient Indian caste system. Guess that's why they call it the casta system. Before the arrival of the Spaniards 500 years ago, it's estimated that around 5 to 6 million people lived in the region that would become Central America, and although there are dozens of different dialects and tribal groupings, the pre-Columbian Central Americans can be divided into roughly 9 or 10 main groupings, the largest of which are the Maya. And this includes the Yucatec, Chorti, Mopan, Kikchi, and many others whose languages are not all mutually intelligible, and there are several cultural differences between them as well. The next largest are the Lenca of Honduras and Cinca of Guatemala, two indigenous groups in the Mesoamerican highlands to the east of the Maya, and interestingly, by nearly all accounts, almost the entirety of these communities have switched over from their indigenous languages to Spanish, so even though they are linguistically assimilated into the Hispanic population, their customs, culture, and appearance sets them apart as indigenous. Other smaller indigenous cultures include the Chorotega or Manguean peoples of the Pacific region of Honduras, Nicaragua, and Costa Rica, who are also largely linguistically Hispanicized, the Tolupan or Hisakian peoples of central Honduras, and the Misumalpan peoples, which includes the Matagalpa, Maagna, and Olawa, although we'll get back to this group in a minute due to their unique culture. The indigenous people in most of Costa Rica and Panama are a large grouping of languages and cultures that fall under the Chibchan family, and this includes the northernmost Chichen peoples of the Pec or Paya in Honduras and the Rama in Nicaragua. One of the smaller, lesser-studied indigenous groups in the region would be the Mihe-Sokuan people, who you probably haven't heard of before, but you probably have heard of the Olmecs, who are believed to either be the direct ancestors or a closely related nation. And by the way, in case you were wondering what's with all the techs and mechs and cans when it comes to the native names of the region, these are actually not their own names for themselves, but rather names given to them by the Aztecs, the dominant group in Mesoamerica at the time of Spanish arrival, although the Aztecs only managed to control a small portion of territory in Guatemala and never subjugated the rest of Central America, which was largely a safe haven for pre-Columbian natives from Aztec raids. And of course, there are small pockets of Aztecan or Nahuan people scattered throughout Guatemala, El Salvador, Honduras, and Nicaragua, and they are believed to have migrated to the region a few hundred or 1,000 years before the arrival of the Spanish, although it's important to note that not all Nahuan tribes were aligned with the Aztecs even at its height. After 300 years of Spanish domination and the destruction of most indigenous Central American communities to disease, by the time of independence from the Spanish Empire in the early 1800s, the total population of Central America had dropped to less than 3 million people, including only 1.2 to 1.5 million natives, or 40 to 50% of the total. The level of death and human suffering during this time is simply beyond comprehension, and the total indigenous population of Central America would not return to pre-Columbian levels until the 1980s, and even up until the present day, there have been a multitude of conflicts between the indigenous and Hispanic people of Central America. Today, although well over 80 or 90% of the populations of most Central American countries have at least some Amerindian ancestry, only around 44% of Guatemala, 10% of Belize, Panama, and Honduras, and 2 to 5% of Costa Rica, Nicaragua, and El Salvador identify as indigenous, translating to roughly 9 to 10 million people. The largest non-indigenous, non-Hispanic minority in Central America are those of African descent, an ethnically, linguistically, and culturally diverse population. During the Spanish colonial era, thousands of African slaves, mainly from West Central Africa, were imported to the region, and over time they intermixed with the indigenous and Hispanic peoples of Central America. Afro-Hispanics, or Afro-Ladinos, are concentrated mainly on the Pacific coast, with Darien and the rest of Panama having the largest number, and their culture is similar to Afro-Mexicans, Afro-Colombians, and Afro-Ecuadorians, albeit with varying degrees of indigenous and mestizo influence. In contrast to the Afro-Hispanics, a distinct culture has developed on the Caribbean coast known as the Afro-Caribbeans, West Indians, Afro-Antilleans, or Creoles. This includes Belizeans, Bay Islanders, Panamanian, Rizal, and Nicaraguan Creoles, who traditionally speak English Creole dialects influenced by migrants from Jamaica, Trinidad, Barbados, and other West Indian islands who came to the region throughout the late 19th and early 20th centuries to work on plantations for the United Fruit Company or construction projects like the Panama Canal. Due to the American influence, baseball is an incredibly common pastime among Central American Creoles. So when you see a baseball player from Panama or Nicaragua, but they're a black guy with an English name, and you think, that's kind of odd. Now you know why. The third group of African descendants in Central America are referred to as Zambos, and this includes very unique ethnic groups such as the Garifuna or Garinagua, who originated from African slaves, intermixing with the indigenous Carib and Kalina of the West Indies, who were then deported to Central America by the British after rebelling against the Empire, as well as the Miskito, who are descended from shipwrecked African slaves who intermixed with the Misumalpan tribes of Honduras and Nicaragua. What's really fascinating is, despite the initial population of these shipwrecked Africans in the 1600s being rather small, only a few hundred people, They eventually allied themselves with the British and conquered many of the surrounding indigenous tribes, as well as frequently warred with the Spanish, and the Miskito Coast became a kingdom under a British protectorate with a mixed British-Miskito monarchy, and it lasted up until the early 20th century. Intermixing between Afro-Ladinos, Creoles, and Zambo communities on the Miskito Coast is not uncommon, although each community has maintained their own distinct identities, cultures, and languages, and this is why ethnicity and identity in Central America and Latin America in particular can get so messy and confusing. There are no clear-cut distinctions between black, white, and Native American communities like there is in the U.S., although in the U.S. those lines are pretty blurred as well. Asian, European, and North American immigration has also significantly impacted the demographics of Central American countries. Directly after independence from the Spanish Empire, Criollos, or native-born whites of Spanish origin, made up only 5 to 10% of the population of Central America, mainly of Castilian or Andalusian origin, but with a significant Galician, Canarian, and Basque component as well in certain regions. Following the fracture of Spanish America, the Criollos largely became the dominant minority in most areas, taking the place of the Peninsulares, and encouraging migration not only from Spain, but also other European, Middle Eastern, and Asian countries in order to raise the populations of their sparsely populated new nations. The largest number of non-Spanish Europeans in Central America would probably be the Italians, with around 5 to 15,000 Italian citizens throughout Costa Rica, Panama, and Guatemala, with many hundreds of thousands more descendants, followed by the Germans, specifically the Mennonites, and French. There are also around 100 to 200,000 Anglos in Central America, mainly along the Caribbean region, and they may be descended from British immigrants from the colonial era or more recent U.S. American or Canadian expats, as contrary to popular belief, the majority of North Americans in Central America are actually not retirees, and although some Anglos may be rather insulated from the locals in gated communities, many others are rather assimilated with the surrounding Latino or Creole cultures. Although it's difficult to see on the map, there are also hundreds of thousands of Central Americans of Arab, mainly Palestinian and Lebanese, Chinese, and a smaller number of Filipino and South Asian ancestry, and throwing it all together, we get quite the fascinating mosaic of cultures, languages, and ethnic groups. Although keep in mind, this is still a work in progress, but I'll still be leaving a download link in the description down below. Keep in mind, I only use AI programming as a resource to gather primary sources, not to use as a primary source itself. And after going through mountains and mountains of historical data and research, I've come to see the world in a much more non-temporal lens by trying to keep in mind all past history of a given region in terms of how it relates to their present and future. 2,000 years ago, the Romans ruled most of the known world. Nowadays, that same Roman identity no longer exists, yet they do have descendant cultures, as Latin America is technically partially descendant from ancient Roman culture, but it's not the same as it once was. It's something different. Logically, that's what happens to all civilizations. They can only get so large before they fracture and transform into something different. Or perhaps in the future, no doubt these various groups in Central America and Latin America will continue to assimilate into the dominant culture, as seems to be the case for the past several decades, with many indigenous communities no longer speaking their ancestral languages. Perhaps one day all cultures in Latin America will start to look more uniform after centuries of intermixing, as is already the case in some areas, which in turn will give rise to new cultures and new identities. Technology is a great and beautiful thing, and maybe someday I'll find a way to fully automate the creation of the maps. Flip side to this, I know AI and the pace of technology can be quite alarming and very scary to a lot of people, especially considering the types of people who might get their hands on it. And although no one can offer any assurances, I for one am definitely looking forward to this new technological revolution, as I could have never dreamed of how helpful it could be for researching and compiling data. So please let me know your thoughts on this map, how I can improve it, and which region I should work on next. I'm not expecting that many views on this video, as I know I've been away for a very long time. But as always, I can't thank you all enough for watching and supporting, and I'll see you next time.